So we're continuing our trip round the refuge tree, which is hanging for us there. And tonight we're in Japan, and we're in the Japanese teachers of the past. Who are these people here on this level, on the picture? And I will admit that I did not find this talk easy to write, okay? And at one stage I got so confused about something I decided to look it up on Wikipedia, and there was a warning on the page that I looked at which said this was too difficult to understand, and was there anyone out there who could write it better? And I felt, yeah, that's a bit what I'm up against at the moment. I need someone to make this easy for me. So I hope this makes sense. So we're in Japan this evening, which is a very particular country at a very particular time and a very different culture. And we're going to look at a particularly influential form of Buddhism, which is Zen. Zen is a very well-known form of Buddhism, practiced in our modern world, and especially in America. We're also going to consider the also well-known, but often misunderstood doctrine called in Japan Buddha nature. Before I do this talk, I just want to re-emphasise the unity of the Buddhist traditions, because sometimes we can step into a culture and step into another form of Buddhism which does seem particularly strange, and it can seem sometimes to be something very different from the way that we understand things or the way that we practice. And there is a very strong underlying unity of all Buddhist traditions. All these traditions aim for enlightenment or Buddhahood, but at the same time the traditions approach this in very different ways and from different points of view. The Zen schools are still Mahayana schools. They believe in the Bodhisattva ideal. And they're particularly schools which emphasise the importance of meditation and its practice. And I think this is quite close to my heart, as I do consider meditation to be the rock on which my personal practice stands. So we're not only moving into a very different kind of culture, but it has its own patterns of assumptions and understandings, which are possibly not our own in our own culture. I remember my brother working a lot in Japan at one stage and needing a very special kind of translator. Somebody who not only could translate the language, but also translate the culture of Japan. It is very different from what we understand to be a norm. And at one stage he was doing a job where things had very discrete deadlines. You know, something had to be done by 2:00 in the afternoon. And apparently it's not on to ask somebody in a Japanese culture to do that. You can't say, I really need this done by 2:00, because it's very, very rude. And so he used to talk to his translator, and he said, well, how are we going to do this? And she said, well, I shall just have to shame them enough to get them moving. So they belong to a culture in which shame is a kind of motivator. I think sometimes we belong to a culture in which guilt is a kind of motivator. It's a bit of a different way of going about things, but I just want you to understand that we're moving into a kind of realm that we are going to find it quite difficult to get the hang of it, or at least I did. Okay. We're going to begin this story in 13th century Japan, and then after a while the story will move on 450 years later to 18th century Japan. And it's a story about two very important Zen lineages which still exist in 21st century Japan, the Soto and the Rinzai schools of Zen. And the debate that we're going to talk about this evening is a debate which still goes on today. So it's not as if it's completely resolved. It's very interesting. So we begin the story with Dogen, who was born about 1200. He was born in Japan, and his father died when he was 2, and his mother when he was 7. He was adopted by an uncle who was an aristocrat, who assumed that he would become his heir. Dogen found out and ran away when he was 12, and joined another uncle who was a hermit, and from there entered a monastery. He was apparently obsessed with a question that no one in the monastery could answer. And this was the question: if all beings already possess Buddha nature, why does one need to arouse the will to enlightenment and engage in practices to realize it? If all beings already possess Buddha nature, why does one need to arouse the will to enlightenment and engage in practices to realize it? So I'm going to leave the story here and explain for a moment what the problem was, because it's not particularly obvious from that question. So I'm going to start with talking about Buddha nature. Buddha nature is a kind of umbrella term for several Mahayana doctrines, but in its essence, it's a profoundly affirming model of human spirituality, which says that deep within us all, we have the potential to awaken to the truth. And in fact, awakening, enlightenment, Buddhahood is our true nature. Its roots are deep in Indian Buddhism, where it's known as Tathagata Garbha. It took me a long time to learn how to say that, and in fact, I've just been told I've been saying it wrongly for a long time. So, Tathagata Garbha. As it travelled eastwards with the adoption of Buddhism in China, Tibet and Japan, it adapted to new cultural assumptions and expectations, and other ways of thinking and practicing developed. It had become a kind of balance to the idea that to become a bodhisattva takes lifetimes. It has a very strong, positive message that we all have the potential for Buddhahood, and that this is inherent in all human beings. Because we all have Buddha nature, enlightenment is here and now and present in this moment. Enlightenment is present in this moment. It's just that we are unable to see beyond our own illusions, our own defilements, greed, hatred and delusion, our old friends, the mental poisons. So the question, if all beings already possess Buddha nature, why does one need to arouse the will to enlightenment and engage in practices to realise it, is a good question. This question took Dogen to China and to Ju Qing, a master in the Soto school, as it became known in Japan. Here meditation was practiced with great intensity. Here Dogen's dilemma was resolved by experiencing what he called the dropping of body and mind in very intensive meditation. Then, with the blessing of his teacher, he returned to Japan and began teaching himself. Dogen is recognised as one of the founders of the Soto sect in Japan. The key element in Dogen's teaching is the non-duality of all phenomena, which can be seen as another way of understanding interconnectedness. He emphasised direct experience rather than labelling or theorising about what goes on around us. This emphasis is not merely conceptual, and to truly know it is to experience it at all times. Dogen saw that Buddha nature and the practices undertaken to realise it were not separate. Practice at its highest level is enlightenment. He emphasised Zazen, which is formal sitting meditation, but not as a practice to engage in, to realise enlightenment in the future, but to experience enlightenment here and now. Dogen said, to practice the way single-heartedly is, in itself, enlightenment. There is no gap between practice and enlightenment, or zazen and everyday life. Practice for Dogen is the manifestation of intrinsic realization, Buddha nature. The Dharma is present in all things, but unless one practices, it is not manifested. All things are always Buddha nature, and seeing this is the nature of practice and enlightenment. So he said, throughout aspiration for enlightenment, practice, enlightenment, and nirvana, there is no gap. Continuous practice is the circle of the way. The act of continuous practice confirms you as well as others. This means that your practice affects the entire earth and sky in all 10 directions. Although it is not noticed by you or others, it is so. This interlocking of practice and daily life is described in Dogen's treatise, The Instructions to the Tenzo. The Tenzo is the head cook in the monastery and holds a very, very elevated position. So here he's talking about he's talking of examples of practice and daily life, where practice and daily life are not separate, they are the same. Maintain an attitude that tries to build great temples from ordinary greens. That expounds the Buddha Dharma through the most trivial activity. And again, to turn things around while being turned by things, keep yourself harmonious and wholehearted. Don't lose an eye or 2 eyes. Take up a green vegetable, turn it into a 16-foot golden body. Take a 16-foot golden body and turn it into a green vegetable. This is miraculous transformation, the work of a Buddha that benefits all sentient beings. And this is one of my favourite readings of all time. When the cook takes the vegetable stem, it must be with the same power with which the Buddha turned the wheel of the Dharma. Our Buddhism must manifest in every move of the hand, every pace of the foot. Not in great matters alone is there to be a great manifestation. In the tiniest thing we must grasp the power that pervades the universe. Everything you do matters. So although he's a bit obscure, I hope that gives you some more of a practical flavour of his teaching. Intense practice, nothing outside it. All things are perceived with the potential for enlightenment, pervaded with the natural law of the Dharma. The problem with this is that it's very easily misunderstood. Dogen taught from his direct experience, but not everyone understood what he was trying to convey. His teaching was profound, but it was also very subtle. He did not say that all beings have Buddha nature. He proclaimed that all beings are Buddha nature, are the ultimate nature of things, which is conditionality. But of course, we are all ready for an easy life. If we think that Dogen taught we are already Buddhas, and all we have to do is sit in meditation and our intrinsic enlightenment will be relieved, reassured, then how wonderful. Wouldn't that be nice? But as Dogen had written, Zazen is not step-by-step meditation. Rather, it is simply the easy and pleasant practice of a Buddha, the realization of the Buddha's wisdom. The truth appears, there being no delusion. If you understand this, you are completely free. Like a dragon that has obtained water, or a tiger that reclines on a mountain, the supreme law will then appear of itself, and you will be free of weariness and confusion. So misunderstanding Dogen's teaching is very easy. Why make our lives more complicated than they need be? We're all Buddhas anyway. What else is there to do? We don't have to do anything. We can have everything comfortable and pleasant. Wouldn't that be nice? Sangha, our founder, once said that in more contemporary times, This has been expressed as, I'm okay, you're okay, we don't need to do anything. Sangha actually said that the truth was more like realising, I'm not okay, you're not okay, but that's okay. Meaning that once we realise that we need to change, then we can choose to do so. This awareness of our shortcomings serves us well. If we think we're okay, we will not be motivated to change at all. There is also another real problem hidden in here, in this, is that if Buddha nature is seen, there is also a real problem that if Buddha nature is seen in this way, is it really Buddhism? Is it a practice that the Buddha would have taught? If Buddha nature is seen as inherent in living beings as a seed or a fixed thing, a fixed part, then is this Dharma? Seeing Buddha nature as a fixed entity is a direct contradiction of conditionality, praticca samappada, the essence of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha taught that we have no fixed self, that there is no element of us that is unchanging. To see Buddha nature in this simplistic way is not Dharma, is not the teaching of the Buddha. Sadly, by the time Hakuin was teaching in the 18th century in Japan, this is what seems to have happened. Zen practice was in decline, complacency and ethical weakness had set in. Hakuin was born into a family of commoners, a frail and sensitive child. His parents allowed him to become a monk when he was only 15. Early in his life, his quest was filled with doubts, disappointments, and even breakdowns. He studied, sought out teachers, and applied himself relentlessly to practice. He became a great teacher at the Rinzai school, which emphasizes koan practice. A koan is a problem or a riddle that has no logical solution. It is meditated upon until logic is transcended and another level of comprehension altogether is reached. Hakuin systemised koan contemplation in the Rinzai school and created probably the most famous koan of all. If someone claps his hands, one hears the sound at once. Listen now to the sound of a single hand. So this is the famous, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Hakuin sought to revive Zen practice, which had deteriorated considerably. He condemned in no uncertain terms what he saw was laxity, wrong understanding, and wrong practice. One of his concerns was the danger of what he called do-nothing Zen. Do-nothing Zen teachers who upon reaching some small experience of enlightenment, devoted the rest of their life to, as he puts it, passing day after day in a state of seated sleep. Practices which sought to simply empty the mind, or teachers who taught that tranquil emptiness was enlightenment, were Hakuin's constant targets. He could be scathing in his condemnation of what he called bands of the unborn Zenists. Unborn because they stress the teaching that enlightenment, being present in all beings, is unborn, unconditioned and unmade. It cannot be pursued, for there is nothing to pursue. In reality, we're all Buddhas already. So this is what he said about Zenists. Stand by, this is a bit of a blast. I have a verse that pours scorn on this odious race of pseudo-priests. Earth's vilest thing, from what all men recoil, crumbly charcoal, firewood that's wet, watered lamp oil, a cartman, a boatman, a stepmother, skunks, mosquitoes, lice, blue flies, rats, thieving monks. Ah, monks, priests, you can't all be thieves, everyone last of you. And when I talk about thieving priests, I refer to those silent illumination Zenists who now infest the land. Where our Zen school is concerned, anyone who achieves Kensho and leaves the house of birth and death is a house leaver, not just someone who forsakes the family home and goes off to have his skull shaved. Still, you find people going around making unfounded claims. I have left home. I am a priest. I am a priest. If that weren't bad enough, they then proceed to pocket the charity and donations they hoodwink lay people, the householders, into giving them. These people do not do a single thing. They engage in no act of religious practice. They don't develop a shred of wisdom. They waste their lives dozing idly away like comatose badgers. Fantastic. Hakuin was noted for his formidable and even terrifying manner. One of his students described him as a sheer cliff, a menacing presence stalking the temple like a great ox, glaring around with the eyes of an angry tiger. Here was a no-nonsense Zen master, not to be trifled with. He also had a reputation for being very kind and compassionate towards people as well. Hakuin stressed the need for continuous spiritual practice. He stressed a never-ending and severe training to deepen the insight of enlightenment and forge one's abilities to manifest it all in all activities. He urged his students never to be satisfied with shallow attainments and truly believed that enlightenment was possible for anyone if they exerted themselves and approached their practice with real energy. As I mentioned earlier, this debate about whether Buddha nature is helpful or not is still going on in Japan today. In 1992, Soto Zen scholars Matsumoto and Hakamaya rekindled this debate in a book called Critical Buddhism. Again, this looked at wrong views leading to unskillful actions. And again, it declared Buddha's nature understood simply and critically as not Buddhist. But that's another and a very interesting story. The story of Buddha nature in Japan acts as a warning to the possible misappropriation of the Dharma. So what can we learn about this episode of Buddhist history? I think there are lessons of two kinds. Firstly, there's lessons to be learned about how we approach Zen Buddhism. To really have some understanding of Zen, we need to guard against intellectualization of teachings. We need to recognise that intellectualization has its limitations and realise that in Zen is about practice, and that in Zen the intellect is actually seen as a hindrance, something that will get away of the truth. Intuition is of prime importance and direct experience. Although Zen sees meditation as primary, it cannot be practiced independently of ethics or wisdom practices, study and reflection. Meditation is not an independent discipline and on its own is not Buddhism. It does not have a transcendental aspect, does not contain a critique of mundane existence and or the path of transformation on its own. Although Zen has its own terminology, emphasis and techniques, we can only really understand it through the lens of Buddhism, through the lens of the Dharma. It cannot be seen separately as something outside Buddhist doctrines and lineages. And we need to see the Zen teachings as fingers pointing at the moon. So the finger points at the moon, and it's just showing us the way. But what we can misunderstand is that we can think that the finger is the teaching and the way, rather than the way to the moon. So the teachings and methods of Zen are pointers to enlightenment and not ends in themselves. And for me, this story also contains some warnings in a more general sense. So it's a precautionary tale of keeping Buddhist teachings faithful to the essence of the Dharma. The Buddha actually talked about this in the Pali Canon. There's a sutra called the Simile of the Snake. And the Buddha in it is talking to his monks about what it's like to misunderstand the Dharma. Misunderstanding the Dharma is like picking up the snake from the wrong end. Okay. And here in this sutta, the Buddha voices a stern rebuke to monks who misinterpret essential parts of his teaching. What moved the Buddha to do so was his deep concern that the efficacy of his teaching should not be impaired by misunderstandings. His teaching would not be undermined from within, and the purity of conduct and wisdom, ethics and wisdom, not be tarnished. To do this, to be careful about keeping true in this way, we have to know the Dharma, question our own experience, and often we need someone to talk to who's a bit further on the path than we are, so we can just check stuff out with somebody. So it's also a story which talks about not misappropriating the Dharma. Many things look like the Dharma, can look similar to the Dharma. People can talk like the Dharma, but sometimes it's not quite Dharma, and we need to be clear. I have a particular toe-curling reaction to New Age magazines, and sometimes it can be so close to the Dharma. It can say all the right things, but it really doesn't have much substance to it. It's kind of keeping it fluffy, or just making things nice, or making you feel more comfortably. The Dharma is in fact uncompromising, and the path would not be true if it let us off the hook. So meditation. Meditation is really important in our practice. I once went to see the Dalai Lama speak in Birmingham, and I was a bit mystified. I hadn't been involved in practice for very long, and lots of people asked very, very complicated questions that I really had no idea about the questions, let alone the answers. And then somebody got up and said, can you practice Buddhism without meditation? And the Dalai Lama said, no. Next question. And I thought, well, that's clear. But meditation is not enough on its own, nor is intellectualization, having a purely intellectual understanding of the Dharma. Nor is just being good. That's not going to work either. And we have to guard against complacency. We have to guard against ethical weaknesses. We have to take the Dharma on as a whole practice. Meditation, ethics, wisdom. And Hakuin talked about the people who didn't really practice Zen properly. And Sangha Ratchatar, our founder, talks about one of his teachers, Yogi Chen. And Yogi Chen had a version of Zen, a particularly wide-ranging, well-understood way of practicing Zen in the West, was called what he called mouth Zen. And this is about people who talk about practicing. They even write books about it or articles, but don't practice themselves. And Sangha Ratchatar said this is very common in the West, so beware, do not become a mouth Buddhist. We also need to guard against thinking there's an easy way to practice, that there's some kind of nice little slipstream somewhere where we can get around everything that's difficult or awkward as far as we're concerned. A quick way to enlightenment. Beware quick ways to enlightenment. They're probably not true. And I think that although we all tend towards comfort, we need to guard against thinking that Buddhist practice is about making my world more comfortable, more convenient, and conventionally happier. The Dharma, intensively practiced, will blow away all our ideas of who we are and what the world is like, and it will free us. Both Dogen and Hakuin were great masters of Zen, both emphasising meditation, zazen, sitting practice, as a strong part of practice. Both believed in the potential of all human beings to achieve Buddhahood. So I'm going to finish with a couple of verses from Hakuin's Song of Meditation, chant in the praise of Zazen. So, at the beginning, so this is the first part. All beings are from the very beginning Buddhas. It is like water and ice. Apart from water, no ice. Outside living beings, no Buddhas. Not knowing it is near, they seek afar. What a pity. And the last verse. What remains to be sought? Nirvana is clear before him. This very place, the lotus paradise. This very body, the Buddha.